It's amazing how even people who don't know the Bible will use biblical terminology or expressions sometime. You will hear people who, again, have never read the Bible say, your days are numbered, and have no idea where it come from. Mrs. H was away this week, and I didn't want to hurt her ears, so I played a little bit of country and western while she was gone. And my youngest daughter, she would say, "Now, Dad, is this a crying, a loving, or a leaving song?" And Vince Gill started out, and he said, "I see the handwriting on the wall." And then you can start guessing this is going to be a leaving song, but that's how it started. He just said, I can read the handwriting on the wall, and it was a song about his sweetheart was leaving and all this other stuff. And isn't it interesting that biblical terms that people have no idea where they came from are a part of our vernacular and our language, and they wouldn't know if it came, they just wouldn't know. And it's always interesting on some of the game shows. I've seen a few of these where there were like 6 categories, and Bible was one of them, and no one wanted to touch it. They were willing to do every bit of trivia and all this other stuff, but nobody was brave enough, to do Bible. And our son was on the academic team, and the other 3 guys, anytime there were Bible questions, they just put down their things, because they just thought if Luke doesn't know it, we don't know it. But it was also nice that he grew up with metric as his native language. And so anytime there were metric equation questions, that's what he had learned initially. And that was a part of his part, world history, the Bible, and anything to do with the math part. But the other 3 wouldn't touch the Bible stuff at all. If you'd like to just write a couple of dates down on the margin, and Wayne has commented about how much white space I leave on my outline, so you'll find some place somewhere to do a small little subtraction. But Daniel goes into captivity, and tonight, let's say 605 BC. It's either 605 or 606. But that's the first time that Nebuchadnezzar captures Jerusalem, takes away, I use the expression, the cream of the crop, and carries them off into Babylon. Tonight, we're going to look at the collapse and the fall of the Babylonian Empire that's going to happen overnight. But just for the date, it's going to be 539. And that's where I want you just to let this sink in for a second. This is why, and we used the example several weeks ago that Joseph at the beginning of Scripture and Daniel at the end, we have these just superb who live in a foreign country all of their lives. We do know that Joseph is 17 when he's taken to Egypt. Rusty memory, but I think he lives in Egypt for 99 years. And then here is Daniel. And so someone help me, if he's 15 when he's taken to Babylon, how old is Daniel in our text tonight? 82, 83. And it's going to be within a couple of years that he's probably going to be thrown into the lion's den. We've mentioned this, but we always have new people in a class. And I do not say this begrudgingly, because we just had such wonderful teachers, but I distinctly remember flannel graph in Bible classes of a young man being thrown in the lion's den. I mean, that's just the visual image. And then later, as you get to looking at it, then, and again, we don't know, we just gave 15 as a, we don't know, but if you just start with that as a possibility, he's well into his 80s. If he was a little bit older, he could be into his 90s, Lord willing, next week when he's thrown into the lion's den. And isn't this amazing? And it's still just the contrast between this just always just kind of reaches out and grabs me. Here he and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are living in a foreign land, and their faithfulness to God is just outstanding and superb, and their fellow countrymen in Jerusalem are still worshiping idols, are still turning away from God. And as Jeremiah says, there are as many gods in Judea as there are streets in the city of Jerusalem. There are as many gods that God's people are worshiping as there are cities in the country where they live. And then here these young men get carried away, and I just kind of feel like mid-teenage years on our calculation. And like Joseph, there's just this complete resolve and commitment and dedication to live for God. And they are just such splendid and such excellent examples. The central idea tonight, and he's done this before for previous kings, but tonight Daniel is going to interpret God's message of impending doom for Babylon. And as we said, in the middle of this feast, the hand's going to come out and write on the wall. When Daniel is finally called, he'll rebuke the king, and the kingdom is going to fall that night, which is just, it's kind of breathtaking that it's going to happen so quickly, and we'll look at that in a second. But thinking again about the original readers of this book, and are they people in captivity, is probably my guess. If you have been uprooted and carried away and are living in a foreign land, at some point you have to ask either where is God, or why did he let this happen, or why did this happen to me? And these exiles, and I like the term exiles because this is going to be a term that's going to come up in the New Testament in Peter and other places, that we as Christians are spiritual exiles, sojourners, while we're here on earth, and these are physical exiles. We touched on this when we were walking through the Old Testament. And let me just mention again, if you're visiting or if you haven't been with us tonight, there are outlines right there in the communion table if anyone doesn't have one, and it'll help to kind of follow along. But you listen to Psalm, and a number of the Psalms are written both while the people are in captivity and exile, and then several are going to be written after they come back. And we touched on this several months ago, but the family of Asaph are such an amazing family, and I refer to them as the Osmonds and the Jacksons of the Hebrew family. One of our fellow teammates, Charlie Powell, that worships at Britton Road, took maybe 2 or 3 piano lessons and 2 or 3 guitar lessons and didn't take any more. And so I did not see the movie Amadeus about Mozart, but if he goes and sees a movie, he has to go early because he has to go home and play every song that he heard that night in the movie before his mind will let him go to sleep that night. It's scary. And we would do 4th of July, the sun would go down at 4:45. But since he plays by ear, he could play his guitar in the dark as well as he could anywhere else, and we would sing a bracket of American and Australian songs. And then you don't wonder when one of the little boy walks by the piano and hits the key C. There's that musical gene. David appoints Asaph as one of the singers in the temple. And when you follow this family through, we have a record of 600 years that every time they have a restoration movement, every time we're going to do things like our father David did, every time we're going to start worshiping in the temple, the first thing they say is, where's the family of Asaph? And this to me is one of the amazing stories of faith in all of Scripture. And we come all the way down to Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're going to dedicate the walls of Jerusalem. So we're all the way down here. And where's the family of Asaph? But in the book of Psalms, again, these people like Daniel, how can I sing the song of the Lord in a foreign land? We were by the water canals of Babylon, and see, this is where Daniel is. Our captors said to us, come on, you Jews, sing out loud. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. And you stop and think, if your city's in rubble and in ruins, the temple's been destroyed, and here you are in a foreign land, and you're being taunted, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And then here comes this heartfelt plea. How can I sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land? And I think one of the things that we as Christians, as we gather to worship, and whether it's public worship, families, groups, I oftentimes think we as spiritual strangers and exiles are singing the Lord's song in a foreign land. And then the psalmist says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if I forget you," and you can tell the person's right-handed, he says, "May my right hand wither, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I do not hold you, O Jerusalem, above my highest joy." And here's this challenge of remaining faithful, keeping your spiritual identity, singing the Lord's song in a foreign land, and being faithful. And that's in Psalm 137. And this is what Daniel and his friends did. And so tonight, they are going to survive the fall of the Babylonian. So tonight, they are going to survive the fall of the Babylonian Empire. And we'll touch on that, Lord willing, in just a second. There's a very interesting person called Belshazzar in our text tonight. And it's always interesting to read biblical interpretation history. For example, there was a long period of time where people just ridiculed the idea of a group of people called the Hittites. You know, this was just biblical fiction and this wasn't true. And then all of a sudden a series of discoveries start being made. And here's this entire kingdom that goes, if you go up to Syria and then into the edge of like Turkey and Asia Minor, then here was this entire empire. And yes, for a period of time, we didn't know anything about it. The same thing was true of Belshazzar. You'll read people in the 1800s especially, and just those who ridicule Scripture, he was one of those main targets. We don't hear about him in history, and who is he? And, you know, Nabonidus is supposed to be the king and all this other stuff. And then these cuneiform tablets and other things start being discovered, and they start being able to translate documents to go back to this particular period of time. And guess what? Here's Belshazzar over and over and again. And what we're going to see is that his father took, and there's kind of a question mark here. His father takes a 10-year sabbatical and leaves. He's doing business and doing other things. We'll touch on it in a second. And while he is gone, then he appoints his son, Belshazzar, to be the king, the ruler of the city of Babylon, while Dad, as the official ruler, is away from the place. And I didn't write it down in the text, but when you read and you hear him say, you know, he who interprets the vision will be third in the kingdom. And again, people who didn't know who Belshazzar were thought this is just really strange, because here's this, they thought, you know, imaginary person. And why is he saying third? Well, he's saying third because his father is still alive. Can we use the word co-regent, co-ruler? And so he is the ruler in the city of Babylon. His dad is going to come back in haste, too late, to prevent the Persians from taking over. And true to history and true to text, as these discoveries are made, then Belshazzar is the king of Babylon, but he's the co-regent king with his father Nabonidus. Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest king, and I use the word neo, that's a word for new. The Babylonians were in this area for hundreds and into thousands of years, and there was just this very brief, bright spot, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to be kind of the high tide mark, and no one comes close to where he was, and the whole kingdom is in a gradual state of decline until it falls to the Persians. So Nebuchadnezzar's father is Nabopolassar, and 626 to 605, and it's during this time, and when we walked through it before, remember, these primary kingdoms toward the end of the Old Testament are in alphabetical order. So the Assyrians are first, and they are going to be defeated at the Battle of Carchemish in 612. Pharaoh Necho is going to come up from Egypt to help the Assyrians, and this is when our good King Josiah gets killed toward the end of our Old Testament. And Pharaoh Necho goes up and joins with the Assyrians, and the Babylonians just defeat them soundly. This is in 612, and by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, I listened to an ancient history teacher, and he said, I'm not sure you could have found an Assyrian alive anywhere. They exterminated them. From the 900s on, the Assyrians had been just the bully on the national block. And when they captured a city, they started a pile of heads, a pile of hands, and a pile of feet as they decapitated people. They march into Egypt, and Egypt says Kephrope, and they surrender. And just for fun, they march to Thebes, which is 500 miles, again, roughly to Memphis, just to kill Egyptians. And no wonder Nahum is going to say at the end of the book of Nahum, the entire ancient world clapped their hands with joy the night that they hear that the Assyrians had been defeated. And so Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar is going to be the general helping with this. The Babylonians are going to defeat the Assyrians and the Egyptians. They're going to go home and defeat. And then Nebuchadnezzar will be the king. And look at the dates, 605 to 562. Lord willing, we'll look at this a little bit later time. There's at least twice in the biblical account where God refers to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. Isn't this interesting? Here is a pagan foreign king, and he is just being as vicious as he can to capture as much territory, and God is going to use him to punish his people because of the idolatry, and Jeremiah will refer to him as my servant. Lord willing, next week we're going to see the Persians are in control. Cyrus is going to be the king of the Persians. And of all things, Isaiah, 150 years earlier, is going to refer to Cyrus as, and get ready, my anointed one. And you stop and think in terms of the Hebrew kingdom, who are the people that God has anointed? Samuel, I want you to go to this family, and here's Saul, and he anoints him. And then as Saul is rejected for his disobedience, Samuel, I want you to go to this family. There's 7 boys, and I will tell you, in each one of them, Eliab and the other brothers keep coming forward, and Samuel thinks, surely this, and then he says, well, is there any others? Oh, there's a runt. You know, the little brother, he's out with the sheep. We didn't bother. Oh, you go bring him in. And God says, I want you to anoint him. The term Christ in our New Testament is the biblical word for one who is anointed. Samuel is such an appropriate person to anoint King Saul and King David. Who anoints Jesus? You know, if he knew what manner of woman this was, he wouldn't let her be touching him. Isn't this ironic? That the creator of the universe and the Son of God is anointed on a couple of occasions, one by a woman of dubious character. Mary is going to anoint him, and Jesus is going to be anointed by women, not by a Samuel. And so God is going to say 150 years before he comes onto the scene, King Cyrus is going to be my anointed one. And what's going to take place is that in Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29, the prophet says there will be Sabbaths in the land of Judah for 70 years. My people will be in captivity for 70 years. And if you're in Daniel 9 and 2, Jeremiah's ministry is going to start in 626. Daniel goes into captivity about 606. So he has had, some time in his life possibly even to hear or to know, but he has a copy of the book of Jeremiah with him in captivity. And Lord willing, later we'll see Daniel is reading in the prophet Jeremiah that it's going to be 70 years. Well, he doesn't have to go to history books. He was a part of the original group who were carried into captivity, and he starts doing the subtractions, and he's figuring out, and this is what's going to happen tonight. Babylon's going to fall in 539, and within 3 years, Cyrus is going to say, go home. And isn't this amazing that 150 years before all of these events take place, in Isaiah into 44 and into 45, then God says, now Cyrus, he is my anointed one, and Cyrus is going to fulfill the 70-year prophecies that are made by the prophet Jeremiah. And the Assyrians carried people off as they did the people of Israel in 721. Samaritans remained. The Babylonians are going to carry the Jews off in 606 and in 598 and then in 587. That last time they destroy the temple, and then you subtract 536 from 606, and what do you get? 70 years. And just exactly like God said, and that's why the kingdoms of earth pass away one by one. The book of Daniel wants the captives to know, you may be in captivity, the city of Jerusalem may be in ruins, all of these things may have taken place. Do not be deceived, God is in control. Now, I'm not by nature a negative, pessimistic person, but hypothetically, the Chinese are in the early stages of a 100-year plan to control the planet. There are over 1 million Chinese living in Africa tonight. And they're making all kinds of deals with third world countries that we will help you with infrastructure with this, but we'd like to put a port here on your city. The entire fishing fleet of the Chinese nation is wired to give information to the military about the position of any other ships, submarines that are in the area. What is the world going to look like 100 years from now if China is in the world place that we are tonight? I mean, it's going to be a totally, totally different world. But God will still be in control, and even if people are not able to meet publicly as we are tonight, the kingdom will still be in place, and God will still be reigning in his kingdom, even if our nation as it is tonight is no longer the world power that it is. And I'm a patriot by heart. I love our country. But we should first and foremost love the kingdom and be citizens of the eternal kingdom. And as God is predicting and saying through these prophets tonight, the greatest power in the world is going to collapse overnight. We had read this earlier. Rusty memory, I didn't go back and check. I think the city was something like 11 square miles. The outer wall, you could ride 2 sets of chariots with 4 horses each around the outer wall of Babylon. And they were so secure in this place that they had water, they had, safety, and they were just sure that they were going to continue on indefinitely. And as the handwriting on the wall is going to say, it collapsed in a night. And we'll see this here in just a second. We won't go through the other kings, but you can see them. They're all short-reigned. Just above 1-2, here's Nabonidus. And so he's going to desert. This is Belshazzar's father. Babylon for 10 years. He goes into Arabia, and there's all kinds of things with trade and with other things. No one knows exactly. He also, this is kind of bizarre, he is a monotheist. He worships one God, and don't get thrown off. The sun god that he worships is spelled S-I-N. And in Babylonian, sin doesn't mean what, none of us would refer to a god as sin, but there were so many other gods. Marduk was the primary god, and he may have been in self-imposed exile, especially because of his desire to worship one God. It wasn't Jehovah, but he is away from the country, totally out of place for over 10 years. The same thing's going to happen in the time of Jesus. When Augustus dies, the two adopted sons that he had both been killed. And when the will was read, Tiberius then was appointed the second emperor of Rome, and he was 55. And he really didn't want to mess with it. And at a point in time, as he got older, he got more ill-tempered and ill will. And he just basically, for 10 years, spent as much time as he could on the island of Capri. And this is where the threat that we hear in the book of John, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. And everybody knew that the emperor was old and ill-tempered and didn't want to mess with a lot of stuff and was kind of in self-imposed exile. And so Nabonidus is going to be doing the same thing here in our text tonight. And just before 1-3, Belshazzar is reigning in Babylon. The Persians are coming. He rushes back to the capital city, is defeated, and the people that he is with are granted kind of an exile, and they're kind of left on their own out by themselves. But 1-3 is what is so interesting tonight. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, run through Iraq, and they join in. Obviously, this is the place somewhere in here where the Garden of Eden was. And what the Persians decided is that this huge river ran through the city, and so therefore they would always have a water supply, because unlike other places, Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem, we got to try to dig a tunnel to have water if we're being besieged. And the Babylonians thought, we have this river running through town, we got these huge walls and everything. Well, the Persians said, let's go upstream and divert the river around the city through another water channel. And while this drunken feast is taking place here in chapter 5, then the Persians have been upstream doing some engineering, and when they close the locks, then they force the whole river to bypass the city of Babylon and go around it. And so therefore the Persian soldiers, Herodotus is going to tell this, are going to be able to wade into the city with water about thigh high, where before it had been this huge river. And so the Persians are going to divert the river all the way around the city. And so these canals, where the river had ran into the city, became entry points for the Persian soldiers to enter into the city. The Babylonians didn't know they were going to do this. They never thought that anyone would bypass the water supply. And that's why the whole city is going to fall in one night. Because if they had attacked them on the walls, all these traditional things, they were prepared for that. But it had never occurred to them that an enemy might bypass the river around the city. And so those water canals where the river came in became the access for the Persians. And that's why the whole city is going to collapse in one night, because the Persians come in totally by surprise. And it's a huge city, but basically the city is going to fall in one day. So here's number one, just briefly the plot. They're having a drunken feast, so Belshazzar has vessels from the temple in Jerusalem brought in during this drunken feast. And then the handwriting appears, writes on the wall. As Nebuchadnezzar had done, he calls for the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers to interpret They can't, probably the queen mother goes back and knows Nebuchadnezzar, and she says, oh, there was a man in the empire named Daniel, and he is brought in. He rebukes the king for his pride and gives the meaning of the message, and that night the city falls and the king is killed. So when we sing the song, the kingdoms of earth pass away one by one, then here in Daniel 5, an entire kingdom falls overnight. So here's number 2. There's a thread that runs all the way through this book, and Lord willing, we'll touch on this later. The God of heaven, the God that the Hebrews worship, is constantly in contest and battle with the different gods that are being worshiped, in this case by the Babylonians. And look at the bold. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster on the wall of the king's palace. What we now know, because of what's going to take place, while they're having this banquet and this drunken feast, the Persians are actually outside the walls. And the plans are, I don't know exactly when the time was, but they knew when it was. Let's use the word the docks or whatever are going to fall into place. The river's going to be diverted. And Belshazzar has no idea of how quickly the end is going to come. The other thing, too, is that they always felt like if we conquer another city, our God is more powerful than another God. And some have wondered, is he trying to kind of rally the troops? Oh, Nebuchadnezzar defeated the God of Jerusalem. And so let's bring the vessels in of a conquered city and let's celebrate, the victory of our God over their God. The wise men come in, they can't read the writing. And then here at the very bottom, notice what the queen says. And what a compliment. Again, think about how old Daniel is and how many years he's been in captivity now. There's a man in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. Nebuchadnezzar made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar. Well, with the passing of all these different kings, Daniel's kind of been relegated to a secondary position. He does not have the same influence and control that he had initially under Nebuchadnezzar. And so when he comes in, Daniel is going to rebuke the king. And we all have had someone talk down to us. We know when someone's kind of, talking down to us. And, are you Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom my father brought from Judah? Yeah, I know who you are. You're one of the prisoners. But we have a good recommendation, so can you tell us what's going on? And very similar things that were said earlier. Notice what, and I'm about a third of the way down. Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. You have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. You've praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But, isn't this interesting? The God in whose hand is your breath. It always is amazing to me, the little nuggets and jewels that we find about God in these just kind of unique places. And Daniel, now an old man, been faithful for decades in a foreign country, says, oh, by the way, this is the God, and how did he say it? In whose hand is your breath, and whose are all of your ways, and you have not honored him. So when he interprets this, and I did this in a couple of ways, the word, I pronounce these mene, tekel, parsin. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. And this is where, again, we'll hear someone say, oh, your days are numbered. Tekel, You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. On that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Here's another, and this one is still going on, where people are saying, aha, there's a later Darius, and this can't be the same one, and this one's 62. I feel like probably Darius is probably either the leader or the general that Cyrus is going to leave in charge of the city of Babylon, because Cyrus, and historically is called Cyrus the Great, is going to be in the process of consolidating this entire empire, and he doesn't want to sit around and just take over Babylon because there's other places he needs to go. I think this Darius is left in charge, but he's an older man, and we're going to find a younger king at a later time. So here's number one. Nothing is accidental in the biblical account. You know, we don't use the three Hebrew names of the friends. We always use the Babylonian names. But for some reason, we typically refer to him as Daniel. And remember, if you have E-L in a Hebrew name, there's something about God. And Daniel means God is my judge. Jerry, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he lifted up himself with great pride? Daniel, God is my judge for Nebuchadnezzar. The handwriting on the wall, God is my judge. And this is always interesting. If you know the biblical names, you oftentimes know the rest of the story of what's going to take place. And here is the one who is named, God is my judge, and because he is going to interpret the handwriting on the wall, God is going to judge Belshazzar, in this case, that very night. So, meaning, you're numbered, you're counted out, you're measured. The years of Belshazzar's reign are counted out to the very last one. To weigh, God found him deficient in the scales of justice and rejected him. And divide, the Babylonian Empire is going to be divided, separated from him, and given to the Medes and the Persians. 2, and this is so important, and we'll, Lord willing, touch on this again. One major message is repeated over and over to the first readers. You are in exile. You worshiped many gods in Judah. The God of heaven is still in control of the world events and the rise and falls of kingdoms. With our son being raised in Australia till he was 12, we come back and, you know, things like Oklahoma history and American history are foreign. And I remember he was maybe a sophomore, and he's studying World War II history, and he says, Dad, he said, Hitler nearly won. I said, yes. I mean, it was frightening how close the Germans came to pulling it off. And how different would the world be if Hitler had won? And this is something that doesn't solve every problem. It doesn't take the anxiety of safety away. But something that's significant for us to learn is that whatever happens to us individually and whatever happens to our nation collectively, at the end of the day, God is still in control. And that's a very important lesson that is taught first to the first readers and is important to us. So what we're going to find is that the Persian army is going to invade Babylon that night, and they're going to reign from 539, and the dates for Alexander are either 333, 331 for 10 years, and then the Greeks are going to reign for 10 years, and then at least in Palestine in 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey is going to come in as a peacekeeping force. The Jews are quibbling and fighting, and the Romans come in, well, we'll help you settle this. And we're just going to bring in a peacekeeping force, and as our Roman history teacher said, and then they stayed for the next 400 years. Mr. Hartman, what are Americans doing in Germany today? Mr. Hartman, what are Americans doing in South Korea? Regretfully, Mr. Hartman, what are Americans doing in Grenada? That's when the invasion had taken place. And if you're the only American in a foreign school, you became the question mark. And he said the first 2 centuries especially were called the Pax Romana. And he said since 1945, we have been living in the Pax Americana. The American peace bought and purchased by American blood. But there will come a day that too will change. And we, as the citizens of the kingdom, need to always remember God is in control. Here's our final thought, and this just gives you the chills. Belshazzar, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. After John 3:16, which is such an important verse, then John goes on to say, "For I did not come into the world to judge the world, but that the world through him might be saved." The first time Jesus came, he came as Savior. The second time that he comes, he's going to come as judge. And notice these. It is appointed unto man once to die, and then comes the judgment. Acts 17, God has fixed a day in which he will judge the world. And he's going to do this in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. He's given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. God will judge the world in righteousness. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. The word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. If you call on him as Father, who judges impartially, according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. Raymond Kelsey raised a question one day in class. He said, if God announced he was coming back on January the 1st at 12 p.m., there would be some people who would wait till 11:45 or 11:50 to repent. If people just knew exactly that's when he's coming back. But God didn't choose to do that. I was returning home, driving back to Sarah while I was at Oklahoma Christian, and was just exhausted. I'd stopped and done push-ups and ran. I had melted a cup of ice down the back of my neck trying to stay awake. And if I can just get to mile marker 25 and pull off and not kill myself, right? I was just so tired. And as I pulled off the exit, I'm just exhausted, this green and yellow meteor hit the atmosphere, and the whole sky just went and was just yellow and green and everything else. And I thought, literally, the hair on the back of my neck, and I thought, he's here. I'm tired, but I thought, he's here. And then the very next thing I said was, I'm ready. And then nothing happened. Can you imagine being in a drunken state and a hand comes out and starts writing on the wall with no body? Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And I think it behooves each of us as the children of God to stop and think tonight, if Christ comes back tonight, what will he say about you and I?